Lebanon invasion was the first time the Israelis went to war without their very existence being threatened. They mounted a blitzkrieg whose objective was destruction of PLO bases in southern Lebanon. It saw the first Israeli-designed battle tank tested in combat against the best from the east. Blitzkrieg II in the air by precision fighter bombers. And as the newest in Soviet fighter power was tested against the best from the west, all silently observed by the newest spy in the sky. Facing the Israelis was Yasser Arafat's PLO, 15,000 men from 8 differing factions. Their main battle group was the 6,000-strong Castel Brigade in southern Lebanon. It had few heavy weapons and was pledged to guerrilla tactics. President Hafez al-Assad himself commanded the Syrian troops who advised them. A former Air Force general, he'd twice been to war against Israel, as Minister of Defense during the Six-Day War and as President of Syria in 1973. The Israeli strategy was devised by Ariel Sharon, hero of the Six-Day War's Sinai battlefield as a tank commander, architect of victory in the Yom Kippur War, now Minister of Defense. But as his forces swept north, he revealed another strategy, designed in fact to force the PLO out of Lebanon altogether, a plan that would bring Israel into conflict with Syria as well as with world opinion. Lebanon was one of the main areas settled by Palestinian refugees fleeing the war following Israel's independence in 1948. But most went first to Jordan to direct terrorist activity against Israel from Fedayeen bases there. The Fedayeen became the Palestine Liberation Organization, driven further into Jordan when Israel occupied the West Bank during the Six-Day War. Their anti-Israeli activities eventually forced Jordan to take military action, and in 1970, in what the Palestinians call Black September, their fighters were defeated on the streets of Amman. By then, Egypt's leader, Colonel Nasser, had forced Lebanon to grant Palestinians autonomy there. Dispersed to Lebanon, PLO activity soon upset the uneasy peace between its 17 religious factions. Full-scale civil war followed in 1975, as the Palestinian state within a state, numbering 500,000 people by 1975, 20,000 under arms, mounted aggressive campaigns against Israel and her Christian allies, who had traditionally dominated that country. 18 months of bitter fighting saw the Christians' very existence threatened until the Syrians intervened. Lebanon thus became split, the south dominated by the PLO, who sharply increased their attacks on Israel's vulnerable northern settlements. In 1978, this brought the Israelis into Lebanon in a major military operation to push the Palestinians out of range. But it was criticized by Israeli hawks for strategic failure in not preventing PLO forces escaping north of the Litani River. Meanwhile, United Nations occupation of southern Lebanon failed to prevent PLO artillery attacks on Israel's northern border. And in 1981, Syria raised the stakes by deploying SAM missile batteries in the Bekaa Valley to protect its aircraft against Israeli attack. Mounting PLO activity convinced Israel that another invasion was inevitable. It was postponed 4 times, until the crescendo of tit-for-tat attacks peaked in 1982. The precision raid on a Beirut football stadium was prompted by the attempted murder of Israel's ambassador in London. It was PLO headquarters, beneath it an arms dump. As PLO artillery hit back, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, with the initial objective of wiping out PLO forces south of Tyre, a move backed this time by an amphibious operation to cut off retreat north of Sidon. But their initial momentum took them to the edge of Beirut. HR, Sunday, June the 6th, 15 years to the day since the start of the Six-Day War. General Drury's armor poured over the border along a 100-kilometer front, vehicles draped in red to identify themselves to friendly aircraft. Altogether, 1,250 tanks, backed by scores of self-propelled howitzers and 1,500 Zelda armored personnel carriers. They'd take most of the day to cross the border. With kit bound tightly to the shells of their Zeldas, the men of Israel's Battle Group A spearheaded by the 211th Armour Brigade, leapfrogged north up the coast road, isolating 3 battalions of the PLO's Castel Brigade, 2,000 men in well-prepared defensive positions. Big self-propelled howitzers were used to soften up such positions from up to 30 kilometers away before the tanks moved up. And as they pounded targets around Tyre and Sidon, mechanized infantry of the 91st Division were already bypassing them to secure a bridgehead over the Litani River further north. The barrage was also backed by airstrikes, answered in turn by anti-aircraft fire. The particular target was the PLO's defensive line, designated Abu Yusuf el-Najjar, Middle Sector, and Beit el-Muqaddes, around the refugee camp at Ain Hilwa. Handheld SAM-7 missiles were also brought against the Israeli jets hounding PLO ground forces as they attempted to set up ambushes against the armored infantry with their rocket-propelled grenades. The air raids continued for several days as the Israeli strategy was quickly set. Decisive encirclement of heavily defended PLO areas like Sidon, allowing the vanguard to speed on. Meanwhile, mobile Russian-made 14.5mm anti-aircraft guns roamed the streets. In the towns like Tyre and Sidon, PLO forces were scattered among the civilian urban population on the living shield principle advocated by their Soviet advisors. It allowed them to turn entire city blocks into fortified areas, which were difficult to attack for fear of civilian casualties. Many people abandoned their homes as the Israelis sacrificed the advantage of surprise by leafleting and broadcasting warnings to evacuate the towns, to avoid innocent casualties as the offensive closed in. Tyre was taken on the second afternoon, street by street, but further north, Sidon proved a tougher nut to crack. Task Force A left the city hemmed in by armour, while the spearhead battalions sped north. Mopping up operations weren't completed until the Israeli infantry mounted a street-by-street, house-by-house operation to clear PLO positions in residential areas. Civilian refugees had warned the Israelis that Palestinians had turned the town centre into a fortress ambush, so the Israelis had used medium-range armoured fire before moving in. Damage was confined to the central area near the port, but the Israelis' progress had been inexorably slowed down. And the Israelis also began the important public relations task of soothing the innocent people who'd lived through it all. An Israeli Army medical unit had been set up, and within days, as many as 250 people had been treated there. To the north, the 50th Parachute Battalion, reinforced by armour, had cut off the PLO reinforcements in the largest amphibious landing made by the Israelis in wartime. And after the spoils of war, the prisoners. Many had either discarded the uniforms that marked them as members of Fatah's Castel Brigade, or had operated in civilian guises. Hundreds of prisoners were taken. This time, Israel treated them as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, after interrogation. For this, they were first blindfolded to prevent them identifying the place where they were taken. Afterwards, they were sent to a camp set up near Tyre. As the Israelis headed north to join their main task force battle group, it was clear that the conflict was already satisfying the Palestinian tactics simply to hold out as long as possible while causing casualties the Israeli public might not want to sustain. By the time resistance at Sidon had ended, the Israelis had lost over 200 killed and nearly 1,200 wounded. But their strategy had cost the PLO some 1,000 dead and twice as many wounded. The continued movement of huge, self-propelled 175mm howitzers and battle tanks made it equally clear that the Israeli strategy was changing. They had headed off criticism from their American allies by stating their objective simply as a self-defense operation to push the PLO 40 kilometers from the Israeli border. And they'd already passed that point by taking Sidon and pushing on at speed. Now, with the reinforcements pouring in at such a rate as to cause traffic jams, and the battle for control of Sidon still continuing, they were shelling and bombing Damour, just 10 kilometers south of Beirut. This had been a Christian town, but the PLO had massacred its inhabitants during the Civil War and taken it over, an act that would find deadly retribution in the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila after the war. On June the 11th, Israeli armor reached the outskirts of Beirut itself, and there it rested as political argument in Israel took over, with many suspecting that Defense Minister Sharon had misled his cabinet colleagues and had really aimed to tackle Beirut itself all along. Did you do much fighting on the way here?
No.
No fighting?
None at all.
None at all?
Okay. Little shot and that's all.
The big guns threatened the city from strategic high points, but for the time being at least, they remained silent. And that halt at the city outskirts is now seen as a major strategic error. Inland, the Israelis advanced on 3 fronts towards the Beaufort Castle, Litani River crossings, Nabatea, and to the east, so-called Fatahland, areas held by just 1,000 PLO soldiers to face Israelis' 36th Division of mixed infantry and armor. This was hill country, its roads barely better than tracks, winding along defiles easily defended by small forces. They would have been difficult to drive on even if they'd been properly maintained, but they hadn't. And they traversed rugged countryside that severely complicated military communications. It was particularly difficult for armoured vehicles, which were better suited to fast-moving thrusts on the flat, and in contrast to the armoured movements on the coast, progress here was slow, sometimes painfully so. Convoys were frequently halted as traffic jams developed in the narrow passes. The vulnerability of slow-moving armour was plain. It presented an easy target for the hit-and-run tactics of the Palestinian Lion Cubs, boys armed with rocket-propelled grenades and trained in commando warfare. Landmines were another danger, particularly to armoured infantry vehicles, but giving them outside fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic internal fires many suffered when hit during the Yom Kippur War. Helicopters now became the main supply link in clear view here of the PLO's main observation post, Beaufort Castle. Its commanding heights over 700 meters above sea level were held by elements of the Jermak Battalion of the PLO's Castel Brigade. Held by only 75 men, they thought it impregnable, just as the Crusaders had found 8 centuries earlier. From there, the PLO could see Sidon in the west and Galilee in the south, targets for the artillery barrages they called down from these dugouts. It was taken during the second night by 200 men of the elite Golani Brigade in 2 hours of hand-to-hand fighting, echoing its capture by the Allies during the Second World War. Next day, it was handed over to Israel's southern Lebanon ally, Major Saad Haddad, and his Free Lebanese Forces. They too had been targets of the PLO artillery directed from Beaufort Heights. A few Golani heard Major Haddad explain his reasons for welcoming the Israeli invasion.
And the Lebanese people was in bad situation, in lamentable situation, wanting to get rid of the occupying forces, but was not able to do it alone. And I used always to say that Lebanon needs a miracle to be saved, and this miracle happened now. And thank you very much.
But Beaufort Castle also commanded the way north to the strategic bridges over the Litani River and the Bekaa Valley. With that strong point taken, remaining Palestinian opposition melted away to reinforce those occupying western Beirut 50 kilometers further north. To the east, Battle Group H, infantry and armored battle groups from the 252nd Division, moved on Fatahland, the PLO guerrilla base near the Syrian border. Its 1,500 defenders from the PLO's Karami Brigade withdrew without a fight. The Israelis quickly crossed the Litani River to concentrate their firepower on PLO targets around Nabatea. Limited by terrain, tanks and mortars were used to harass PLO communications, ammunition dumps and fuel depots. Nabatea, a major PLO stronghold, was taken with little fighting, and the 62-ton Merkava, or chariot tanks, that moved in unopposed, were an Israeli design that would turn the tank battles to come further north. With the big guns unable to play a decisive role in assaulting PLO infantry positions, they were taken in a fire and movement manner more typical of the Korean War. And the armored infantry of the 36th Division rolled quickly through Nabatea and on towards a series of major encounters with the Syrians. By evening that second day, and as the prisoners were brought in, the PLO's Jermak battalion had ceased to operate as an organized military force. As the Israelis pressed north, their aim of pushing hostile forces out of range of their border made confrontation with the Syrian army inevitable. It took the form of a series of armored battles and one of the biggest dogfights in the history of air warfare as the Israelis advanced into the Bekaa Valley. Syrian infantry emplacements at the southern end of the valley had been reinforced by their 91st Armored Brigade within a couple of days of the outbreak of fighting. A farming area, its terrain made concealment easy and allowed wide fire cover from surrounding mountain slopes. And 30 kilometers to the rear, the Syrian SAM missile sites threatened the air cover the Israelis needed for a major tank assault. The battle was joined, however, on the floor of the Bekaa Valley, north of Lake Karun. This first significant armored battle of the war saw Israel's Merkava tanks engage the Syrian 82nd Tank Brigade, whose brand new Soviet T-72 battle tanks were thought invincible. The Merkava's squat turret and front-mounted engine afforded its crew high protection. Only one was wounded. With its 105mm gun, it had been designed specifically to take on the Syrians in mountainous areas, and enemy tanks could be engaged up to 2 kilometers away by using its laser rangefinder. Despite Syrian deployment of their Gazelle anti-tank helicopters armed with wire-guided missiles, the Merkavas destroyed 9 T-72s in fierce fighting. Knocked-out tanks littered the battlefield after a victory made possible by the most significant act of this campaign, the destruction of the Syrian surface-to-air missile sites which had dominated the Bekaa Valley since 1981 and had recently been reinforced. It was made possible by reconnaissance using the remote-controlled drone spy plane, the Scout remote pilotless vehicle with its highly sensitive movie camera mounted underneath. Catapulted from a mobile ramp, it beamed back live pictures of ground activity, enabling Israeli jets to be directed accurately onto their targets. Guided by remote control, lens magnification produced clear pictures of enemy movements, observing individual soldiers as well as fast-moving tanks. It meant that had this drone been spotted, enemy reaction would have been monitored by its cameras. In the event, operators believed it was never detected, remaining airborne for up to 7 hours at a stretch over the missile sites, which had already been in action earlier in the fighting. Israeli jets directed onto the sites used smart bombs, which locked onto the missile system's own radar to guarantee hitting them. 17 batteries were destroyed, and the other 2 put out of action without loss. This brought the Syrian Air Force into the fighting, and a major air battle began, involving 100 aircraft from each side in dogfights over 2 days. The Eagle of the Sky, the F-15 Interceptor, spearheaded the Israeli squadrons and quickly proved its superiority. In In the first 3 hours, 29 Syrian MiGs were destroyed, again without Israeli loss. More were lost to their own SAM missiles before the Israelis neutralized them. This pilot, you can just see him in the haze, managed to parachute to safety in the hills. Next day, the Syrians again challenged the Israeli Air Force as it provided cover. They lost another 35 MiGs, bringing their total aircraft losses to 71, and effectively putting the Syrian Air Force out of the war. That enabled the Israelis' Cobra anti-tank helicopters to join battle, tipping the odds further in favor of Israeli armor as it moved forward to face the Syrians' 3rd Armored Division. They would do battle for control of the Beirut-Damascus highway as it passed through the Shuf Mountains. By now, Israeli objectives, as on the coast, had shifted. And while their armor pressed into strategic positions overlooking the potential battlefields, self-propelled guns pounded PLO positions in towns along the highway. Targets were pinpointed, towns like Jamor and Aria, straddling the main road into Beirut, as the artillery sought out PLO positions and lines of communication. The Syrians had reinforced the remnants of their 3rd Armored Division, but lost over 50 tanks in a series of battles among the fortified villages, often along the highway itself. Then, once again, the armored infantry moved up to take over the newly won positions. On foot, they carried out classic house-to-house sweeps to clear any further resistance from either Syrians or PLO. At one point, they took me into private houses in the middle of residential areas, which had been used to store ammunition, complaining bitterly that PLO were using civilians as a shield to hide behind. Hidden tunnels proved to be massive stores of ammunition, boxes of bullets, mines, shells, grenades, and even rockets stacked to the ceiling.
The other boxes are TNT, ammunitions, landmines. This one is Russian.
Yes.
And outside, the tanks lined up, leveling their guns on Beirut itself. After agreeing a ceasefire with the Syrians, the Israelis now linked up with their Christian allies to the north, and encirclement of the Lebanese capital was complete. The war of attrition began. The Israelis had reached Beirut just 6 days after crossing the Lebanese border. But instead of moving in quickly to end the PLO presence there, they paused, allowing Yasser Arafat's men to dig in, thus setting the stage for the most bitter conflict of the war. Tracer shells homed in on suspected PLO positions. The artillery and tanks that had encircled the city aimed their fire at specific buildings thought to be centers of PLO defense, communications, and operations. The bombardment was relentless and went on by day and by night, and flares used to locate targets previously pinpointed by air reconnaissance or spotters on the ground. Another dawn and grim reminders of the night's fighting. Another ceasefire violation answered, disrupting international moves to bring peace and a PLO evacuation of the city. In a deeply dug, complex system of underground tunnels and basements, the PLO awaited a move by the Israelis to try and take their positions. The rocket-propelled grenades that had already inflicted significant casualties on Israeli armor were constantly at the ready as the men relaxed and went about more domestic tasks. Their exit was far to the rear, through tunnels that took them up to half a mile from the front line. Far from the impact of the big guns, new recruits received sniper training for the street battles that were thought inevitable. Using the Soviet Dragunov, regarded in the West as imprecise, they homed in on a recognized enemy. But success was variable. Anti-aircraft emplacements and an old T-3485 tank placed among housing emphasized that the PLO was still adhering to its living shield tactics, even if its men were fatalist.
On this side, waiting die. We don't afraid from die. We came here to die.
But the tragedy was still being visited on the more general population. Inevitably, civilians also suffered from the bombardment. And it was already impossible to tell new damage from that inflicted in the Civil War. From the corner of another residential area, PLO rockets seeked the artillery that had hounded them. Israeli casualties would top 350 dead and 2,200 wounded. Backing the tightening artillery net, the Air Force mounted daily pinpoint bombing attacks which reached a peak in mid-August. Always, the anti-aircraft cannon replied, almost always ineffectually. As with the artillery, the fighter bombers were directed onto suspected PLO concentrations. But this was an innocent rope factory. The PLO also hit back with SAM-7 missiles, this one arcing back just too late for its target. But watch the ground tremble here, a direct hit on a huge underground arms dump. Here, the bombs missed their priority target, the PLO leader himself, Yasser Arafat. This headquarter building was hit just an hour after he left it, but the backbone of his communications was broken. Somehow, the innocent carried on. For a month, the attrition continued. Then the Israelis mounted a pincer attack on the airport to isolate PLO enclaves around it. Armored infantry took advantage of the fast surface to avoid presenting sitting targets to snipers in tall buildings beyond, while in the suburbs, heavier armor tightened the net on the PLO resistance. By now, negotiations were advanced to move them out of Lebanon altogether, and bluff and threat joined both sides' armory. An Italian Bersaglieri battalion was amongst the small multinational force which supervised the final withdrawal of the PLO fighters to other Arab countries, Tunis, Yemen, Syria. The traditional gunfire salutes emphasized that if defeat had any scent of victory, It lay in there having withstood a sometimes hesitant Israeli assault for over 2 months. The hero's send-off for Yasser Arafat underlined it. His men had held out far longer than the 6 days impressed upon them by their Syrian allies. They too had to withdraw forces, 2,700 men of their 85th Brigade heading back down the Damascus highway. And then more gunfire salutes as Fatah battalions followed. But the war with no beginning would prove to be a war with no end.